Let's take our sales data 2016 working file. It already has some data within it. We've already given that data a name, so we can jump straight into creating pivot tables. Let's create a new sheet. And in here, I would like to insert a pivot table. So that's insert pivot table. The pivot table or range is actually my named range called data. Okay. Because I've named the range correctly, up on the right hand side appears the column headings for my range. Our aim with this pivot table is to look at adding multiple fields into either the row or the column headings. Now this is achievable, but it makes more sense if the data has a natural breakdown. For example, here in our data, we could have a double heading of country followed by city. And we can see it breaks down into unique countries. So it firstly groups by country and then by city. And you can see naturally breakpoint there, Australia, and the cities that fall within it. Bangladesh has 1, Belgium has 3, Channel Islands has 1. And we can go down the list and see that some countries have more cities than others. But that only logically works because the data has cities within countries. If I were to move these the other way around, which I can do by dragging, then it groups by city first and then by country. Well, each of these cities only belong to one country, so then the data doesn't make sense. When you have multiple columns in your rows or in your columns, you need to make sure that they are in the logical order, so they break down, effectively drilling into further information. And I could do the same with this information in the columns. I could put country there and then city below it. Not quite as easy to read horizontally, but it's still doing the same breakdown. There's Australia, there's the cities within Australia. There's Bangladesh, the cities within Bangladesh. And you'll see that until we control our subtotals, we get a subtotal for each country. If I were to add in a quantity there, see we then get quantity for each of the cities separately and then a grand total for Australia. And the same for Belgium, Channel Islands, etc. Although they do look and make more sense if they're in the row section. Then you can see things easier. Australia and its cities with the cities' totals of quantity and then a subtotal quantity for Australia. Right at the bottom of the table, we then get our grand total. That's multiple columns from your data that you can then use in your pivot table if the data makes a logical break. Now, sometimes the pivot table does a bit of work for you. So let's leave the sum of quantity in the middle, but come back to the date field here. Now the date field, if we actually look at the data, contains, naturally, dates. So individual days when particular sales have been made. If we now bring the date field into, let's say, the rows section, you'll see that we don't get an individual row for each date. We actually get some clever grouping going on that I didn't ask for. I'll just move this up slightly. We can see Excel has already grouped things by years, quarters, and then the actual date. So in my pivot table, I see 2009, 143 quantity sold, but I can break that down and see that broken down by quarters, and then I can see that broken down by actual months. So we can see February, March, April, May, and June. Although the actual column contains the date field, Excel has spotted that the pivot table has done some work and created years, quarters, and date. Now, if I don't want the quarters in there, I can drag the quarters out, and it will leave me with years and date. Now, date is actually the month. If I go into the field settings, I can change date there to say MTH for month. Okay, and then that makes more sense to me over here. Now I have two groupings within the pivot table that I didn't have to create the unique data for. I didn't have to go back into my data set, my sales data here, and create 3 more columns, one for the year, one for the quarter, and one for the month. Pivot table has done that work for me. Once they've been created, what you will then notice up in the upper half here is we have our data, and the quarters and the years and the month have now suddenly appeared even though they do not exist in my raw data. Excel has created those. Just as soon as I use the date field in a grouping, so in the rows or the columns, Excel then says, aha, you don't actually want individual dates because there's a lot of individual dates. With a date field, you probably mean years, months, and quarters potentially. So it creates those groupings for me that I can then use in my pivot tables. That's adding multiple columns into the rows or the columns. If there's a logical breakdown in the data, such as we had country and then city, then it works quite well. If you have some date fields, then Excel will do the work for you and create this grouping by year, by month, and by quarter, so you can make use of those as multiple row headings or multiple column headings. If the breakdown isn't natural and doesn't make sense with the data, then multiple columns in your pivot table will just make it impossible to read. As long as you put some forethought into your planning for multiple rows and columns, then the pivot table will do the work and do the summarizing for each of the subsections within your main field that you're splitting down by.